Hi, and welcome to the Property Development Derisked podcast. We get the experts in to help you keep your projects on track. In today's episode, we'll be covering sustainable construction and specifically reusing existing buildings and how to make that process easier, quicker, and greener. Today, we have a former housing minister joining us on the podcast, Mark Prisk. Mark has a full career of experience in the property sector, both in the private sector and in the heart of government. In this episode, we also cover Mark's career journey and his new role as a chair of the £3 billion Affordable Homes Guarantee Scheme. Hi, Mark. Really good to have you here.
Hi, good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And just to start off, I thought I'd allow you to kind of expand on your background in the property sector and what you've done in the past, all the way to kind of becoming housing minister and what you're kind of working on at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So yes, perhaps unusually for a housing minister, I actually have some knowledge of construction and property professionally.
Always good, isn't it?
Always makes a change, given how many of them there have been. So I'm Cornish by birth, but went to Reading University to do land management back in 1980. And that then led on to working first at Knight Frank's, as they were then called, Knight Frank and Rutley, to give them their due. And that was good experience because that was at that stage, I'm not quite sure which bit of the property world I wanted to go into. And they do a really good sort of internship for graduates. So you spent 3 months in retail, 3 months in industrial, 3 months in the city offices, and so on. And so it gives you a really good taster for what those different markets are like and how they work. And I kind of moved in the direction of development, in those days, commercial principally, and to a degree, some industrial. That I was there for 2 years and then moved on to a practice called DWW, which was unusual. It was multidisciplinary. So I've always been used to working with architects, with planners within a business. And although today that sounds very normal, back in the 80s, it was actually prohibited. Different professions were not allowed to be in the same enterprise. So it was, I always felt that was a nonsense because most solutions require a holistic approach. So having different strands separated artificially just seemed to me bonkers.
What was the reason for that split? That sounds very strange.
It was very much tied in with the professional ethos of the different occupations. And so architecture should be a proper architecture practice. Surveying should be, that kind of attitude. And I guess, to be fair, this was the time in the mid-80s when the City of London itself was going through a big bang. And they themselves, there were different things you weren't allowed to do in the financial services within a business. So the notion of bringing different professions together to provide special, joint services was very much becoming the vogue thing in the 80s.
And the multidisciplinaries were born.
Yeah, exactly. And today you just think, why on earth wouldn't you have done that from the starting point? But I think you have to remember that the social status of those professions was such that the attitude was very much that, to have become an architect, to have become a surveyor is something that should be protected. And therefore we don't want other people who are in a surveying practice not having the qualification. So it was those kinds of rules and regulations that, I understand the ethos, but actually in the end, it's about the solutions and the outcomes, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So you started off, you went to Knight Frank. So you got the holistic background at Reading. You went to Knight Frank. Then you moved from there and went to the DW.
Yeah. So I did quite a lot of urban regen work there. Got to know the team down at London Docklands. And there was Reg Ward, who was the first chief executive there, was a real visionary. And again, this is in the days when the City of London bigwigs, the notion of going to a postcode beginning with an E, east of the Tower of London, was just, that was where the docks were, manual labor, whatever. And so, again, it was an interesting environment because suddenly somebody was saying, well, actually, why don't we move some of the big major office headquarters to this area? And so that was a fascinating insight into not only a multidisciplinary approach, but also understanding the interaction between different types of buildings and uses. So, if you have a serviced office environment, if you have retail together with that, you have offices with that, and some housing, but less so in those days. So again, it was a good idea the notion was to try to regenerate it. The notion was to try to expand not only the city, but also the economy of London. So that was a really good experience. But I'd always wanted to go into politics. And so I had my sort of eye partly on that. And my parents had actually said to me, look, if you want to go into politics, that's fine. It's a chancy old game. Go and get something solid before you do it and build a career that way. And then when you're old enough and ready to go, you can. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter because you've got something to fall back on.
Yeah.
So it was good advice. And I perhaps being quite cautious, took the view that, yeah, that's probably a wise move. But thankfully, I was able to stand for Parliament. I was selected. Took 3 goes. So stood in Newham in the East End of London, first of all, in the 92 election, then stood in 97, which was when we had the Labour landslide. And that was down in Wandsdyke, near where I had a number of family members between Bath and Bristol. It's mostly now the constituency of Jacob Rees-Mogg, actually, these days. And then that didn't work out, so I had to restart. I was self-employed at the stage, so restart my consultancy, which again was in that field of urban regeneration and multidisciplinary work. And ran that for another 4 or 5 years and was chosen by the local association in Hertford and Stortford. And to be fair, I've actually been based in Hertfordshire since really late 1980s.
Do you have to be based in that locality to be chosen? How does it have
to be? But I think the trend in the last 25 years has been, correctly in my view, towards people who have a genuine sense of local connection and root. And I kind of lived, so Derek Woden Waters, which was the sort of full name of DWW, had a base in Roydon. So we did deals right across Hertfordshire. So I kind of got to know Harlow and Hertford and Stortford and so on. I knew what the business base was. I understood the geography. And having lived on the west side of Hertfordshire, I kind of understood the way the different communities worked and so on. So that took me up to the 2001 general election, when I got elected with a princely majority of 5,000.
Yeah, amazing. And that's third time lucky, and
yeah,
and all credit to you. 2 times where it didn't work out, and it's what you wanted to achieve, and then went for it the 3rd time. And
yes, and I think there's something, and some people, so up until this point, everything, all the costs of traveling to the constituency. So, for example, when I was self-employed and going to Wandsdyke, I was the prospective candidate for 2 years. So I would work Monday to Thursday. I would drive down to the constituency on Thursday afternoon. I rented a flat. I campaigned Friday, Saturday, Sunday, drove home, back to work, and I did that for 2 years, and I did it at my own expense. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that to complain. What I'm saying that is people sometimes have this assumption that somehow somebody, the party or whatever, is paying for it. Not a bit of it. And so, it is quite a commitment to stick at that. And in that case, I lost. So,
and then you want to do it all over again.
Yes. Yeah. I think if I hadn't been selected in 2001 or hadn't got elected to Parliament in 2001, I don't think it would have been fair to take my wife through all of that more than 3 times. So I just kind of took the view that, if it works this time, great. If it doesn't, well, you can't say you haven't had a go. So, but, Hertford and Stortford was a strong Conservative seat. 2001 wasn't a brilliant year for the Tories. We were in opposition yet again. But nevertheless, I was in Parliament, backbencher, and keen to learn.
Yeah, excellent. And then around 10 years after that is when you became the housing minister. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So the way it works is that in opposition, you're a backbencher, and being a backbencher in opposition means you're about as irrelevant as you can be. But that actually is quite good, because it's a good chance to learn the ropes and maybe not, crash and burn too publicly, because no one's that worried particularly. So it's a very good way to learn. Now, fortunately, I was asked to join the front bench of the opposition the following year, in fact, in 2002, when I was an opposition spokesman, first in the Treasury, then in the business department, all the way through until we got to the 2010 election, as you said. And then so at that stage, Ken Clarke was my shadow Secretary of State. I was his number 2 in the business team. George Osborne was Shadow Chancellor. David was in number 10. No, he wasn't in number 10. He was aspiring to be in number 10, but he was the leader of the opposition. So that I had 7.5 years in opposition.
Yeah,
it's formative. Again, it's not easy. It's quite hard work. You tend to only get noticed when you make mistakes. At my level, I wasn't shadow cabinet, so. People are looking for someone who said something that didn't quite fit with the party line, and then it gets, spun around the media. So thankfully, I was reasonably secure or safe in what I would say, and was working very much at developing business ideas right across the enterprise sort of agenda, as it were. So for small businesses and so on. So we got to the 2010 election, and that meant that we got in, albeit in a coalition government. So I've actually only been a member of a coalition government and not a member of a Conservative government, a majority government, which is interesting. I enjoyed it. I think the Lib Dems, for the most part, we all worked together. We had an agenda. We had a joint manifesto agreed. And so I think, we got on and did some good stuff. Remember, in 2010, the government came in and there was no money. I know that sounds very familiar now, but it meant that those things you'd aspired to try and do, you had to try and find savings from somewhere else before you could do them. So it was tough, but I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I was shadow minister for business. Sorry, I was minister for business and enterprise for 2.5 years, and then became housing minister thereafter for a further year. The business minister role included construction, for example. So I was very much involved in the Green Building Council, in the establishment of BIM across major construction and engineering projects, and really getting to understand the nature of the construction and development sector as a minister. And then going into housing, obviously focused in my time, my principal work, I guess, if you say what are the outcomes, I think number 1, got the build to rent sector up and running for the first time. We're seeing the fruits of that now. Number 2, I think, was unlocking about 15 different sites that had got stuck. In 2012, we were still coming out of the financial crisis, lots of housing sites, big ones, 2,000 homes, 3,000 homes, really stuck. Sometimes cash, sometimes planning, whatever. So getting those unlocked, which would be the equivalent of 78,000 homes, but reform in the private rented sector, and also a fairer deal for the affordable housing sector in terms of the rent multiplier and so on. So, those were the sort of principal things that I was able to do in that year. And then David, I think I hadn't necessarily fitted in with number 10 special advisor's view on having starter homes. I didn't think they'd ever happen. I just thought it was a bonkers policy, and I'm not surprised. I'm not necessarily pleased, but I'm not surprised that it actually no starter homes were ever built.
Yeah.
So sadly, I was right. But I think the fact that I really wasn't playing ball as far as the number 10 special advisor was concerned on housing meant that I was a relatively straightforward person to chop. And so they went on the back benches, became the Prime Minister's trade envoy to the Nordic and Baltic countries, which I enjoyed.
During your time as housing minister, you also were involved in Help to Buy as well, right?
Yes, very much. Well, yes. So what happened there was we were looking at how can we make it better for first-time buyers.
Yeah.
And the critical thing was, as it always will be, I suppose, to a degree, how do we make that deposit affordable? And that was very much at the heart of the Help to Buy program, the deposit scheme. Tricky one. So, for example, we obviously had to develop that idea in confidence. And then the Chancellor, George, announced it in the budget. And I had 10 working days from the public announcement to the public launch to have it up and running so that anybody who asked, came into one of the home agents and said, we've heard this thing about the help to buy. How does that work? They'd have all the information. They'd have the training pack. They'd have the,
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a head that I didn't see much of home for the 10 days during that period. But it worked. In day one, people came in, they asked their questions, they knew what they were, and, it worked.
Yeah.
So, that launch I'm proud of. I mean, I think Help to Buy should have been around for maybe the rest of that parliament, but it went on for far too long.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's helped a lot of people. I know in my buildings, lots of people that wouldn't have been able to buy here if they didn't have it. Talking about kind of build to rent as well. It's funny. I'm in the middle of one of the biggest kind of developments of that in London. So I'm in the centre of Wembley Park.
Yes.
So we've got all of Quintain all around us. And yeah, there's so much build to rent money flooding into the UK in different areas.
Well, I think my view was the private rented sector was too reliant on smaller landlords who weren't that professional. The housing stock is quite old, therefore it's in poor repair. And the model for buy to let is you acquire a property and you hope to make a capital gain. So it's relatively short term. And actually what you really want is something that's more professional, where you have people wanting to invest for 30, 40 years. Therefore, the lease term's longer. Therefore, the quality of the housing stock is new and much higher. And suddenly you start to give renters real choice about having what's available. And I mean, heaven forfend, if we hadn't got the build to rent at the moment in London, given what else is happening in terms of the private rented sector, the supply would be even worse than it is now. And it's pretty ghastly as it is. I mean, there's a whole series of problems there. So, so the build to rent thing is something I feel is a lasting change to the housing market that I had a part in getting up and running.
Yeah, excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Obviously, that a quick overview of about 25 years there.
Yes.
So appreciate it. In terms of kind of today's session, we're talking about reusing assets, so property assets, homes, buildings to deliver either homes or to use for other purposes, and comparing that against new build. And you wanted to talk around the opportunity that there is in the construction sector to be reusing properties more efficiently for sustainable development.
Yes.
Why do you think that the reuse of properties is so important?
Well, so I'm currently chair of the government's Affordable Housing Guarantee Scheme, and that's about providing lower cost loans so that housing associations can build hopefully something like 28,000 more affordable homes. So I'm not saying that there isn't a role for new build, but what I am thinking about, the more I encounter this, is when I look at the numbers of homes and the number of buildings that are empty, you think we're missing a trick here. For example, at the moment, there are around 260,000 empty homes, never mind general buildings. And when I say empty, I mean from 6 months or more. There's considerably more than that for, say, 3 months. So you can start getting a sense of this. And those are buildings that exist now. There is a key to open the door, they exist. So the opportunity to get those back into use, I mean, if over the next 12 months those came back into use, let's say half of them came back into use, it would add another, 100 and, well, assuming it's 260, another 130,000 homes over the next 12 months would be a huge jump. And actually, because you're not having to build it from scratch, the properties exist. Some might need some improvements, of course. Some might need repairs. But actually, it's something you can do in a question of weeks and months, not in years. So it just seemed to me that actually there was a challenge. And then I looked further and discovered that about 25,000 of those are actually owned by councils, in other words, the public purse themselves. And not only that, they also own something like 25,000 small shops in our high streets. So above which, there are considerable opportunities to create flats, and yet that property is empty.
Yeah.
So you just think, well, actually, there's an opportunity here, in addition to the new build program, which is important, to think how can we nudge the dial so that in legal terms and in financial terms, and just in terms of the culture of the construction sector, the premise that we should look to reuse buildings and get buildings back into use as quickly as possible needs to be the default position, which it is not at the moment.
Yeah. And in terms of those kind of 260,000, what type of properties are these? Are these kind of high street retail shops, or are they kind of existing homes? Or is it a mix of everything?
Yes, so the 260,000 these are homes that have been empty for 6 months or more.
Okay.
The 25,000 shops I talked about are in addition, and they're
okay.
All I was just saying was that they're another group, and those 25,000 are actually owned by councils. But take the 260. There's a wide range. Some will be in very poor repair, undoubtedly, but from the estimates I've seen, the vast majority are stuck in different legal scenarios, or they're build-to-let landlords who are struggling to make ends meet. And also there are some where they are looking at estate renovation in a year, 18 months, and they have been decanting the properties in the meanwhile. So it's a very wide cross-section, and that's why I'm not pretending that every one of the 260,000 can be instantly brought back into use tomorrow. But I do think there's an opportunity to be much more concerted in trying to get them back into use, and also to look at the barriers that are there. Certainly when I talk to developers and talk to owners, there seem to be legal barriers, both in terms of the planning system, but also in terms of the Landlord and Tenant Act. There seem to be data problems, and there seem to be financial disincentives. So it seems to me those are the sort of three areas that we could make some changes on that would actually unlock a lot of those homes.
Yeah. And I speak to quite a lot of housing associations, local authorities, and some of the housing associations I've spoken to, I know they do kind of a estates review where they look at all of their large estates, and they might think, and they look at them to think, should we retrofit that and kind of get it up to standards, or should we demolish it and start again? And sustainability is definitely a key part in that decision.
Yes.
And the benefits of starting from scratch obviously allow you to maybe create some more advanced designs that might not have been done 50, 60 years ago, and maybe more windows, more light, all that sort of stuff. But then they're balancing it against the cost of building brand new, and
Absolutely.
and the sustainability aspect of that, of all that concrete getting demolished and going to waste. So are you looking at this as well as the potential for kind of estate regenerations, or are we purely right now focusing on empty homes that can be quickly turned into new properties at this point?
Well, I think it's got to be the latter, but you're right to highlight the challenge which I encounter when I'm engaging in terms of the Affordable Housing Guarantee Scheme. When I talk to the heads of the local housing associations, they have got this big capital problem that, yes, they're trying to build new, but they've also got an existing housing stock, some of which can be modernized to make it sustainable and meet the new MEES regulations in terms of energy efficiency. But there's a hard core of their housing stock, often quite older, although actually I have to say some of those 1960s and 1970s buildings, the quality was very poor, and some of those are going to struggle to get anywhere near the standards that are needed. So they do have a problem there about how do they turn those around. And there will be some, to be honest with you, that are and these are properties currently in occupation, but the question for the housing association is, they've got to make their total stock up to a certain regulatory standard, and these are just never going to get there. So I think this will need similarly innovative thinking. But to be fair, it's slightly separate from the general point I'm trying to focus on today, which is if we've got existing buildings that are homes but they're empty, what are the barriers to turning those around and getting them back into use?
Considering the lack of social rented homes that we're delivering and the numbers have reduced over the years, it might be a good opportunity for councils to take them over and support people who need that supported housing?
Yes, it can be. I think in some instances, though, the rules. So, for example, in planning, there's quite a few properties that are empty that are in conservation areas but are not listed themselves. Something like 10 to 15,000, and these sit idle. And because the current planning rules are very tight about the nature of the material used and renovations that are and are not allowed, we end up with empty buildings when actually we need homes. So I personally think we need to have a sensible look at the planning regulations to see how, for example, and I'm taking conservation areas as a good one, is how we can't be a little more flexible and a little more realistic. So we don't end up preserving buildings that are empty, but actually we conserve the best parts of those buildings whilst bringing them back into use as homes. And it's getting that balance right, I'm not a preservationist, I'm a conservationist. And the difference is that, all too often there are people for whom preserving the building is the only thing that matters. And I would actually say the worst thing you can do for a building, for its status and its condition, is to leave it empty. The whole point of the built environment is to provide shelter for us, and therefore making sure that they are able to be brought back into use, being a little more flexible around the materials, a little more flexible around the construction process, a little more flexible around the end result will make a huge difference in those areas. So that's one example. The other one, which I think is important, one of the things that frustrated me when I was housing minister was I used to say to my officials, well, I know that in every high street, whether it's in Bishop Stortford in my constituency or some of the towns in Cornwall from my home area, I know that in every high street, if you look above the ground floor, there are empty rooms that were once homes but are not in use. What is the cause of that? And we did quite a detailed survey around it. One of the things that we discovered is that under the Landlord and Tenant Act, of course, the buildings are let as a whole, the ground floor and the first floor. And so there's no real incentive very often for the tenant to use them other than for putting stock or whatever into them. And so one of the things that struck me is we need to adjust the way in which that act works so that the incentive is for them to get that space back into thorough use. Not all of it will be possible. But, I know from having actually previously been an owner of a property, the old estate agency business that my dad used to own down in Cornwall, upstairs, that was able to be converted into residential. And that, if you think about it, if every town centre's probably got, say, maybe 100 of those that are convertible and could be made into homes, there's probably 300 or 400 if you think of the number of high streets in different towns. But if 100 of those came back into use, they're right in the middle of the town centre. They'll be relatively lower cost. They're only requiring a degree of conversion. And so it's getting those sorts of legal barriers out of the way so that the whole legal and planning environment is nudging people to wanting to make sure that space is brought back into use. And it's those sorts of legal things that I think are a good example of the barriers that we face.
That's a really interesting insight, because we've got this issue where some high streets are having issues and people are not going into the high street as much as they were before, online shopping and all this sort of stuff. Well, the solution there is bring the people to the high street and they're living there. Those retail units might turn into different uses, right?
And a lot of young people looking for that first flat or whatever, the prospect of being in the town centre, where the buzz is, they're probably near where all the bus routes are if their work isn't immediately available to them on foot. And so actually it's a good first opportunity. And if those properties were then, the range that I was trying to nudge them towards was to say, right, we need to change the system so that anyone who owns those properties is incentivized to bring them to market, but that the local authority would offer to manage it for them. So they don't have any management issues. They don't have to worry about the burst pipes and all that jazz once it's let. The letting and the management of the letting will be dealt with by the local authority. And they, in turn, would, of course, suddenly find they've got another 50 or 100 properties in their town, which actually will be very valuable for them.
Yeah, which comes off of the amount that they're paying for private rented to house temporary
Absolutely.
accommodation.
So it just, that's one area, I think, which is quite good. I think the second thing that came up in this discussion with various people, and it's been clear in the reports by the RICS and by the British Property Federation recently, is, when I talk to people about, well, what's stopping you from making getting these buildings back into use and making them environmentally sustainable, one of the things that keeps coming up is the inadequacy of the information about what the choices are and what the costs and the benefits are, and the EPCs, the energy performance certificates, which everybody in residential is grappling with, are frankly, as they stand, inadequate, and in many cases not fit for purpose to be the benchmark upon which either a homeowner or a landlord is trying to modernize in order to make the properties sustainable.
Yeah, completely agree.
And there's, I think probably some of the listeners to this will know this, but not everybody does. But there's this bizarre situation that if you rip out your gas boiler and put in a heat pump, an air source heat pump, thinking you're doing the right thing, it is quite likely, I'm told, that actually your energy performance certificate measurement will go down and not up. So there are these really. I think the problem is that the benchmark was designed for different purposes, and now it's been latched onto as being a sort of all singing, all dancing benchmark upon which people can then judge how efficient their property is as a whole, and they're just not fit for purpose. So they need reforming, and I would also suggest that alongside that, what we need is really effective information. So I think about it selfishly, perhaps from my own point of view. What I need is a professional to come along and say, right, at the moment, you're at, I don't know, EPC D. These are the choices. These are the 6 or 7 principal things you can do. And these are the likely costs of those things that will get you to either C or B or A or whatever once reformed. And then I've got useful information. I've got a clear benchmark. I know where I stand. I know what I need to do in order to improve that performance, and I know what the costs are. But at the moment, you do an EPC, that doesn't tell you what the options are. It just tells you what it's a snapshot, and it's inadequate. And then you have to go for a separate assessment. And they very often, how confident are you that they're going to give you independent information? If you go to a loft insulator, the chances are they're going to tell you that loft insulation is the best thing you can do, when it might be something else. So it's getting that, do you know what I mean? It's that use, what I call information upon which you can act, which is what
I think there's a huge opportunity here for some industry player, a new industry entrant to come in and shake that up a little bit, because the EPCs are not fit for purpose. You can't really rely on that information, and it's from some calculations which are quite high level, really. And as you say, you need to know, okay, what do I need to do next in order to get it up? And if we've got these new legislations coming in and we want to hit net zero by 2050, and someone was telling me before that all the homes that we will have built by 2050, over 80% of them are already built. So we need to be updating, retrofitting, and improving what we've currently got in order to get there. But without that information, it's very difficult to make decisions on how much you're going to spend, what you're going to spend it on, to get to which point to be able to hit those targets. And another point on it is EPC ratings as well. Are we trying to improve our cost on bills, or are we trying to improve our emissions on the planet? And those are two different things. And the EPC rating doesn't really, it focuses more on bills rather than emissions and net zero. So if we're all targeting EPC to help us to get to net zero, really, it's not really tied in for that. Something new needs to come in.
Well, and that's where that's why, for example, the gas boiler being ripped out and the pump coming in, actually, because it's bill orientated as it stands, the current EPC regime, it isn't actually helpful. And I think it's, I've always taken the view that what you have to do in government is to create a regulatory framework that's clear. People understand what the rules are. It has to be enforceable, but it also has to send the information that's of use to people. If it's information that they can act on, then most people, if you nudge them gently with the right legal framework or the sticks and carrots in terms of incentives or disincentives, then most people will try and do the right thing. So government's job isn't to stand over them in great detail. Government's job is to create that framework, and then make sure they've got the information they need upon which they can then act. If, at the moment, most homeowners will say, well, what do I actually need to do and how much is it going to cost? And how do I know that if I spend money on that, for my savings, that I'm actually going to improve the EPC? It's all that. And is the EPC the thing I really want to improve? So, it is this circular argument at the moment.
Yeah.
And that's why I think reforming the data is so important. There was a good piece for the bigger landlords, I thought, as well, which is similar, which is moving towards lifetime carbon assessments. And this is really going to help some of the bigger buildings where you've got to make a difficult decision on whether or not embedded carbon, we're thinking about the Marks and Spencer's building on Oxford Street, high profile case hauled in by the Secretary of State and the Planning Inspectorate. And then there's this sort of emotional argument about whether it's a lovely building or whether it's an iconic building and blah, blah, blah. All of those matter, but actually the fundamental thing that matters is, first of all, the assessment as to whether or not there is a genuine benefit from demolition or not demolishing in terms of the carbon assessment. And that's where, as we have done in the past with commercial viability statements, if you look at the lifetime, in this case, carbon assessment, not cost, then actually that will help us have an informed debate about whether certain iconic buildings should be just reused. I think in many cases they would be, but you'd have some proper data. And I always think that the danger when you're trying to change behaviors, you've got to have the basic information about where you are now, what the options are, and what the implications are in cost terms, and in this case, in terms of carbon emissions. So, it's that kind of good benchmark that I think is really important.
Yeah, and we're definitely not there yet. It feels a little bit Wild West, and some people are selling their kind of buy-to-lets and things because they think legislation is going to come in. And I think, there's a lot of clarity required around this space in order to help us get there. 2050 is not that far away, and we've got a lot of
No, it's not. And
performing
about
buildings
it at the moment. So in theory, we have the shifts in the MEES regulations for commercial buildings from the 1st of this month. And we're running towards a situation in which some buildings will not be lettable or saleable in the commercial sphere unless they reach a certain standard. And to be blunt, some of them are never going to get there. And so does that mean that at this moment that building is valueless? Because something is only worth what somebody else will pay for it. And therefore, if your building can't be sold, can't be let in its current form, and it's too expensive to be able to modernize it, to be able to make it saleable, then what the hell do you do with it?
It's like the cladding issue, but for commercial.
Absolutely. And so this is where sensible regulation and then working with the insurance industry and so on is making sure that you get the right dynamic so that actually all the incentives are nudging you towards, taking the right course. And at the moment, I know why they're going down the path, but I don't think they've linked the regulatory change with the fiscal side, and that's important. And in some ways, that actually leads me on to my sort of third area here in terms of housing, which is about VAT. I suppose this was one of the things that frustrated me when I was sort of looking at this as housing minister about getting those high street shops back into use. For a lot of them, it was going to be quite expensive. And I think this issue's moved on even more now because with the need to get every home up to EPC, hopefully reformed, but EPC C and maybe B in due course, the need for retrofit and reuse is huge, and I actually think it would be wise for government to reduce VAT for all reuse and all retrofitting projects. I wouldn't make it 0. I'd probably make it 5%. And the reason for that is that VAT is obviously a very important part of government income, and it needs that to pay for schools and hospitals and all the rest of it. And it is short of money because of the huge costs of the pandemic. But actually, the market would probably respond just as well to dropping from 20% to 5%. It would be a 15% saving, which I think what would happen is that market would grow substantially. There would be a lot more activity. And actually, the Treasury's loss in revenue would probably be very small. Indeed, they might even, dare I say, make a small notional profit, as it were, in inverted commas, from it. They might actually generate more revenue if they grew that market. And for most businesses, most organizations, taking 15% out of refurb and retrofit properties, projects, would actually bring a whole raft of things into being viable, which at the moment they're not. So my feeling is that what we should be looking to do is to think about, particularly in terms of the environmental retrofit, but more generally, and this is where Treasury has a habit of wanting to say, yes, but people will use it for things that we haven't planned for. And you kind of have to say, you either ring fence this and make it hideously complicated with endless, you can't do it for this and you've got to have it policed for that. And if you're using certain materials when you're buying them, if you're using them for this purpose, the VAT rates that. And if you're using them, all that's nonsense. That doesn't work. So you have to bite the bullet. And my view would be what they should look at is the retrofit and reuse market, the materials and the labor, and think about how they can bring that all down to 5%. And that would, I think, unlock a huge amount of activity and nudge a lot of people who are thinking about it, but, maybe hesitating, into thinking, actually, do you know what? This is a good time to do it. It's cheaper than it would otherwise have been. Let's go for it.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting an insight of how to make these, how a housing minister would be making these decisions internally and all the things to consider. But yeah, I think it's a massive challenge to get the industry where it needs to be for 2050, and as many levers that can be pulled to support it and get it to accelerate would be super, super valuable. So 100% agree with that one. But yeah, we'll see if that comes in. That might be a prediction, Mark.
Well, I think they are looking at it. I think inevitably, and I don't blame Jeremy Hunt in the slightest for this, he's inherited a financial nightmare, and he's trying to steady the books and make the people who still lend to the United Kingdom reasonably comfortable that we're sensible folk who aren't going to throw, I'm trying to choose my words politely here. I'm going to do something just as bonkers as we had last autumn. Because when they do that, then what do? The interest rate goes up. Because if you think that the person you're lending a lot of money to is a bigger risk, then surprise, surprise, you're going to do it at a higher cost. So I think he's making sense there. But I actually think that this will be the moment. And it may well be they're holding this back because they've only just this last week got out their response to the Skidmore review and all the other stuff in terms of construction net zero. So I think what they may be looking at is possibly doing this later in the year. I think they should. I just kind of feel there's nothing worse than empty buildings that could be homes, whether it's in our high streets or, in existing estates. And I just kind of feel that if we could make those regulatory changes, if we could get the data right so people have got things they can act on, and then if there are some financial incentives, that would make things a lot better.
Yeah. And you kind of stole my last question from me, because I wanted to ask you, if you were housing minister today, what would be kind of the key change you would make, and would that be one of them, the VAT on reuse?
I think it would. Yes, I think it would. And I think what it needs to do is to then have that package of information. I would reform the EPCs. I'd make sure that people have got, that all homeowners and all renters and their landlords have a sensible piece of information that they can apply for, so they can find out where they are, what they need to do, the different options, different prices, because some people will be able to spend a few £100s, others will be able to spend some thousands of pounds. You've got to give people, practical choices. And then I'd nudge the behavioural change with that tax cut on reuse and retrofit, because the need to get this kick-started, I think, and I wouldn't, well, I would just announce it in that way. There are ways you can finesse it, but that's how I would do it. So I would reduce VAT for the reuse and the retrofitting of the whole residential sector.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Well, we covered a lot there, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to show the audience before the end of the podcast?
No, I mean, I think I've always taken the view that what we do in every housing sector, whether it's affordable, whether it's the private rented sector, whether it's home ownership, has an impact on the others. And that's why I think it's really important that, I'm very encouraged to watch and listen to people now thinking about the interaction. In the past, there tended to be the view that housing was either all about home ownership or it was all about social housing. And actually, you've got to think about them in the round. I know the two main political parties tend to still be a bit binary, but hopefully we can educate them a bit more.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And if someone from the audience would like to get in touch, what would be the best way? On LinkedIn? Or?
Yes, sure. Go to me on LinkedIn. I'm there, and all my contact details are there. And I do a regular series of blogs on housing and so on, and on commercial property as well, because I work in that sphere. So be very happy to hear from people.
Yeah, excellent. And leadership coaching as well, which
yeah,
awesome. Okay,
lovely. Thank you.
I really appreciate it, Mark. Thank you for joining. And to the audience, yes, you'll have all the comments and contact details below as always. Thank you for joining us, and see you next week.